Welcome, I'm David Levine. I'm co-chairman of Science Writers in New York. I want to thank Joe Bonner, my co-chair, who is producing this. Our guest today is Dr. Paul Offit. He's director of the Vaccine Education Center at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, as well as professor of vaccinology and professor of pediatrics at the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. He's recipients of many awards, including the J. Edmund Bradley Prize for Excellence in Pediatrics from the University of Maryland Medical School, the Award in Vaccine Development from the Infectious Disease Society of America, and awards from the NIH. He is the co-inventor of the rotavirus vaccine Rotatech, which is recommended for universal use in infants by the CDC, and it's credited with saving thousands of lives. So Dr. Offit, welcome. So let's talk about the Russian vaccine, since we were chatting about that a few minutes ago.
All right, so about a week ago or so, Vladimir Putin got on the airwaves and said, we are the first country to approve a vaccine. We are ahead of the race. We've checked all the boxes. We're going to be making millions of doses. We hope to get the vaccine out in September. And then they began offering it to other countries. So what is the story with that vaccine? Well, it's actually two vaccines in one. The names are replication defective adenovirus type 5 and replication defective adenovirus type 26. So what is that? And adenoviruses are sort of viruses that cause common colds as well as other symptoms. By making them replication defective, these two human adenoviruses, those viruses cannot reproduce themselves in your body and therefore cannot cause disease. That's the good news. The other good news is that they took the viruses and engineered them, re-engineered them, so that they contain the gene that codes for the protein that sits on the surface of coronavirus, the so-called spike protein. That's a key protein because it's the protein that attaches viruses to cells. If you can make antibodies to that protein, then you can prevent the virus from attaching to cells, or said another way, prevent the virus from infecting you. So the way that those vaccines work is you inject people with these viruses that don't reproduce themselves, but do make that coronavirus protein. So you make the coronavirus spike protein, then you make antibodies to the spike protein. So that's all good news. However, all Russia has done is a so-called phase 1 study, a dose ranging study. They gave the vaccine at a certain dose to 39 people. That's it. Now, we don't know a lot. Presumably nobody died. That's good. And all these people presumably had an immune response, although we really haven't seen the details of that either. Putin said they've checked all the boxes, even though one critical box they haven't checked is whether or not this vaccine is safe and whether it works. The only way to know that is to do a large phase 3 trial, which they have not started yet. Now, we are in the midst of phase 3 trials in this country, so we're actually ahead of the Russian vaccine. And until you do those phase 3 trials, which is to say large, prospective, placebo-controlled trials involving thousands, tens of thousands of people who either got the vaccine or didn't get the vaccine, you don't know whether it works. The other thing, it's just a side issue. Well, two things. One is that they've now said that that the vaccine can also be can be a strategy by which one can prevent flu, so you don't have to give a yearly vaccine. In other words, and people have been working on this for 40 years roughly to try and figure out the universal flu vaccine, so that you can induce an immune response, so that independent of what new strains come into the United States every year, you're going to be protected. I actually trained in a laboratory at Wistar Institute that was a flu lab. And the guy who was the head of that lab said something I'll never forget. He said, if you want a research career that lasts the rest of your life, study influenza. The point being, you're never going to make a universal flu vaccine, and I suspect Russia hasn't done it either, because they haven't even shown that this vaccine prevents coronavirus, which is really its job. The other thing, and it's another important point that never gets picked up by the media, is that Merck, when they tried to make an HIV vaccine, used a replication defective human adenovirus type 5, which is exactly what this vaccine is. What they found out is that the people who got that vaccine, if they'd ever been exposed to natural human adenoviruses before, which is a reasonable percentage of the population, that when they then got this vaccine, it increased their risk of AIDS. So that never gets talked about, but it's why this strategy should have never been advanced, really.
So isn't he actually doing a trial by just giving it to the Russian population?
Yeah, so those are called Wedge trials. So it's what happened with the Ebola vaccine. So when the Ebola outbreak happened in West Africa, The vaccine, there was two vaccines that were brought into West Africa, both of which were vectored vaccines, to see whether or not the vaccine worked and was safe. But they didn't do it in a prospective placebo-controlled way. They just gave it to people. The thinking being not everybody's going to get it all at once. There'll be people who get it and people who don't get it. And that way you can figure out whether it was effective, and that way you can figure out whether it was safe. So if at least they're following those people to see whether or not they then get the disease or don't get the disease, coronavirus, that would be one way to do it. But we don't like to do it that way as a general rule, because we'd like to prove that things are safe and that they work before we give it to millions or tens of millions of people.
So I've had a curious thing. People kept telling me, asking, when is there going to be a vaccine? Ask Dr. Offit, when's there going to be a vaccine? But I don't plan to take it when it first comes out, because I'm afraid that the side effects, I'm afraid that we won't know enough, so I'm going to wait. So I said, well, somebody has to go first, or else we're going to have a vaccine with nobody taking it. Have you heard that people said they're going to wait?
Yeah, sure. There were two polls, one of which I saw by Boston Globe, where they found that about one-third of people said they wouldn't get this vaccine if offered. And then there was just recently a CNN poll where it was more like half the people said they wouldn't get a vaccine if offered. I think, frankly, if I was asked the question, would I get a COVID-19 vaccine if offered? I think my answer would be, I want to see what the data look like first. I mean, I want to see whether or not my age group, I'm over 65, whether I am adequately represented in those trials so that I can know whether the vaccine works. I want to know how many people it was given to safely. But if I was told that 20,000 people got this vaccine without having a serious side effect, that it was 75% effective at preventing severe, meaning moderate to severe disease, the kind of disease that causes you to go to the hospital, the kind of disease that causes you to go to the morgue, and that 1,000 people were dying every day in this country, I would get the vaccine. I think most people actually would. But right now we're asking about a theoretical vaccine, not a real vaccine. Let's see what people say when there's a real vaccine that's out there that's been tested in tens of thousands of people. I mean, the thing with vaccines is, or any medical product, is you never know everything. The question is, when do you know enough to say that a vaccine's benefits outweigh its theoretical risks? And I think if we got to that point, we could say that.
So tell me about the vaccines that are in development and when you think we might have a vaccine, if we have a vaccine.
Right. So every vaccine strategy that has ever been used to make a vaccine before is being used to make this one, as well as several vaccine strategies that have never been used to make a vaccine before. And those are the ones that are in the lead. The reason they're in the lead is they're the so-called plug and play strategies, which means you know the protein of the virus you're interested in. It's the spike protein. You know the gene that codes for that spike protein. So you can very easily take that gene and inject the gene itself, which is what the messenger RNA strategy is. So then you translate that gene into a protein, which is the spike protein. Then you then make antibodies to that spike protein. That's the mRNA approach, similar to the DNA approach. Similar to these replication defective human or simian adenovirus approaches, you just plug in the gene that codes for the spike protein, then you give these viruses, or you just give the gene itself, and then you watch people make an antibody response to the protein they've made. The reason that those are the first strategies is that they're the easiest to construct. You just plug in the gene, and they're also the easiest to scale up. So I think that's why you're seeing them first. That doesn't mean they're going to be the last best vaccines, but if they work, great.
Okay. I just want to say that if you have a question, there's a Q&A box. Please put all your questions in there. Do not put them in the chat box, in the Q&A box, and we will get to your questions in a few minutes. So there are none now, so it's a good time to start putting them in. So who do you think, I've heard that these vaccines will first be given to healthcare workers, and then the elderly possibly. I'm not sure, but I'm not sure.
Right. So the decision about who's going to get vaccines first will be made between two groups: the so-called Advisory Committee for Immunization Practices to the CDC and the National Academy of Medicine. The only group I've heard actually state what they imagined would be that first group so far has been the CDC. And what they've said is they've said that this vaccine would go to healthcare personnel, essential workers, which includes, say, mass transit workers, people who work in pharmacies, grocery stores, meat packers, arguably teachers, adults greater than or equal to 65 years of age, long-term care facility residents, i.e. nursing home residents, adults, and then people with high-risk medical conditions. They estimated that if you just include those people, that would be 120 million people of a population of roughly 330 million for what is a 2-dose vaccine. So you'd have to get basically 240 million doses of vaccine out there to just this first group that would be getting the vaccine.
Are all the vaccines going to be 2-dose vaccines?
All the initial ones look like that. The mRNA vaccine, the DNA vaccine, the replication defective human adenoviruses, the replication defective simian viruses, which is AstraZeneca. So Pfizer, Moderna, J&J, AstraZeneca, those are Novavax, which is using a purified protein approach. Those are all look like 2-dose vaccines.
Okay. And who do you think will get the which vaccine do you like?
I'm a member of the FDA Vaccine Advisory Committee. I have to sign a confidentiality form where I check the box that says that I am not allowed to publicly express preference for any vaccine.
Okay.
And I don't know. The honest answer is I really don't know. I mean, I'm open-minded to which vaccines will be the best. I know which vaccines induce the best neutralizing antibodies. So that's just a fact. I can state that fact that the antibody, the vaccine that induced the highest titers of virus neutralizing antibodies was Novavax's vaccine, which is a purified protein vaccine. So in this case, you just take the protein that's on the surface of the virus, the spike protein, and you inoculate people with that. It's made using a recombinant DNA technology, actually the same vaccine, same strategy that's used to make a vaccine called Flublok. So there is experience with this kind of strategy, a commercial experience. So that's another advantage. But whether that ends up being the best vaccine, only time will tell.
I guess I worry a little bit about compliance. I know the HPV vaccine is a 3-dose vaccine, and they're trying to make it a 2-dose to increase compliance. I know the new Shingrix vaccine is 2 doses.
Well, so the HPV vaccine is 2 doses for people less than 15. For those over than 15, it's 3 doses. Okay. And the shingles vaccine is a 2-dose vaccine. That's right.
I just had my first dose, and it was painful, but we'll see. But I do worry about the compliance. I also, people say that we don't have enough syringes to give all the vaccines that are needed. We don't have enough equipment. Is that really true?
I don't know. I mean, this is all being done out of a program called Warp Speed, which is this mass production program that's run by the administration. And it's really in the hands of the Department of Defense to acquire these materials and then to distribute the vaccine out to the public. And then it's going to be up to states and local governments to at the local level then get the vaccine out there. It's not going to be easy. I think it'll be doctors' offices, probably pharmacies, large chain pharmacies that'll be doing this. And some of the vaccines, like the messenger RNA vaccines, the Moderna vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine. I mean, again, we have no commercial experience because there is no vaccine that's ever been made using that strategy. But it has to be maintained at minus 80 degrees centigrade, which is minus 112 degrees Fahrenheit, which is dry ice. So you're going to need to ship on dry ice and store it on dry ice, for which we have no previous equivalent. It's not going to be easy, these vaccines.
Are these vaccines going to be free?
Yeah, my understanding is they're going to be distributed for free. That the administration costs may have to be covered by the insurance companies, but with the vaccine will be no charge. Government pays.
All right. So, and I also want to ask you, you're a pediatrician, and I just want to ask about school openings and the fears that are, several universities have opened, now they're closed, going back online. I know I live in New York City, and the teachers are threatening to go on strike, even though it's illegal. And I'm just wondering, what's your thoughts about, what's your thoughts about school openings?
I think when you're talking about colleges, and we just went through this thing with University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, I just think you're asking students to do something they're not going to do. When you ask them not to party, not to drink, to make sure they wear masks, social distance, it's like the opposite of a college experience. I mean, this is you're asking them to come to college, but in no sense have a college experience. Plus, you're dealing with a group of people, 18 to 22 years of age, who believe themselves to be invulnerable. I just think that combination means that it's very hard for these students to do. This is why North Carolina, which opened up, then found they had an infectivity rate of around 13%, so they had to close again. And I just think that's going to be a typical experience. You can't expect people to do something they have no interest in doing. My daughter and her boyfriend and my wife and I had a dinner last night. That was the topic of conversation. My daughter graduated from college a few years ago, And she's made that very clear to me. No one is going to do what you're asking them to do.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to take some questions. All right, so one is, my kids are going back to daycare in September.
I'm not sure what it's saying.
That was a random thing by Alexa, sorry. My kids are going back to daycare in September. I trust that all reasonable precautions will be taken there, but I'm wondering how safe it will be to continue outdoor gatherings with our close family, including young children and grandparents in the early 70s. I know this depends partly on case numbers in our area. Any guidance would be appreciated.
I think we just have to do the best we can do about wearing masks and maintaining social distance. That's it. I really do think, to be honest with you, we're not going to test our way out of this pandemic. I think it's too hard. The fact of the matter is there's a lot of asymptomatic infection out there and pre-symptomatic infection where people are shedding, and that you're not going to identify them by testing because most people are asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic don't get tested. So therefore, probably it makes the most sense to just assume everybody you come in contact with is either asymptomatically or pre-symptomatically infected, and you wear a mask and social distance. Assume that, because that's probably the best way to get control of this. And that's the way other countries have gotten control of it. I mean, Germany the other day had 11 deaths to our 1,100, which is to say we had 100-fold more deaths in Germany and we're 5 times bigger. So other countries have done better than that. We have 4% of the world's population and 20% of the world's deaths. We're just terrible at this. And I just think it's the nature of us. I think it's the nature of Americans. We feel it's our right to do what we want, even if that thing that we want is to catch and transmit to other people a potentially fatal infection. It's just hard. So I just think, I think we're going to get to the point where we're going to have to decide how much disease and death we're willing to live with. If we want to avoid any disease and death, we should all stay inside for the next couple of years. We're not going to do that. The minute you walk outside, you're taking a risk. So at least do everything you can to mitigate that risk. At least do that, realizing you're not going to eliminate the risk. So if you have the outdoor barbecue, do your best to wear a mask and socially distance. But if you're all about to sit down and eat, realize there may be an asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic shedder that's sitting right next to you. And certainly if you're someone who's older or has other pre-existing medical conditions, I wouldn't do that.
So, phase 3 trials typically test a vaccine on thousands of people. What kinds of problems, side effects are you concerned we might see when millions of people are given a COVID-19 vaccine? And are they likely to vary by vaccine type?
The one that worries me a little is based on history. So in the 1960s, there were 2 vaccines. One was against measles, and the other was against a virus called respiratory syncytial virus, which, like this virus, is a respiratory virus that causes pneumonia. The NIH group, headed by Bob Chen, took that virus, respiratory syncytial virus, and killed it with a chemical. It was an inactivated virus. Take the virus up, grow it up, kill it with a chemical. So that's the way we make the inactivated polio vaccine. It's the way we make the hepatitis A vaccine. It's the way we make rabies vaccines. Take a virus, inactivate it. What they found was when they gave that vaccine to children and then just let them be exposed to natural virus or not, what they found was that the children who got the vaccine were much more likely to develop pneumonia, much more likely to be hospitalized, and much more likely to die than children who didn't get the vaccine. I'll tell you why in a second. That same thing happened with the measles vaccine, 1963. Took measles virus, inactivated it with a chemical. Now this was on the market, unlike the first one, which never made it to market, and then give it to children. And what they found was those children who got the measles vaccine were more likely to develop pneumonia, more likely to be hospitalized, especially with this atypical rash, than children who never got the vaccine. So the reason is that both of those viruses have, when they attach to cells, fuse to cells. They're not sort of just taken up on the receptor and then brought into the cell by a process called endocytosis. They're fused to cells. That's how they get in. They fuse to the cell. They have a fusion protein on the surface, and by inactivating it, you critically altered that fusion protein, so it didn't look like what it normally looked like on the virus, and so people made this aberrant, perturbed, weird immune response to it, which hurt them down the line. The reason that's relevant to SARS-CoV-2 is it too has a fusion protein. That spike protein is a fusion protein. So you look at China, which just made an inactivated vaccine and is now in phase 3 trials. That worries me a little bit, but they chose not to inactivate the virus with the same chemical that was used to inactivate RSV or measles. They used a different chemical. So maybe that'll be the difference. But I guess that's something people are aware of. I don't think that's going to happen. But the good news is that you have programs like the Vaccine Safety Data Link, so that when these vaccines roll out, and they are in millions of people, you'll know fairly quickly whether there really is a serious side effect associated with the vaccine.
Um, when I worked for the Lung Association, we were always trying to get the flu vaccine rates up, 'cause they're still very low, about 50%. And I said, why don't we just announce there's a terrible shortage of the vaccine? And I think that gets people to line up.
Beanie Baby phenomenon.
Yes.
A limited edition flu vaccine. It's a good idea.
Okay, so here's a question. Who should not get vaccinated? Super seniors? Which pre-existing conditions should be excluded?
Well, super seniors can get a shingles vaccine because they're at risk of shingles. I think
What's a super senior?
I guess someone over 80.
Okay,
That's what I'm guessing.
okay.
So it depends. I mean, it depends on whether there's data showing that the vaccine is safe and effective in various age groups. I mean, certainly those over 80 have a something like a 15 to 20% mortality rate from this virus. So, you want to make sure you get them. You want to be able to vaccinate nursing home residents as well as staff. So I don't think super seniors are a reason. Is there a reason not to get certain vaccines? Certainly if it was a live, weakened form of the virus, then you wouldn't want to give that to anybody who's severely immunocompromised because the virus could reproduce itself more than you want it to reproduce itself. So there are certain things that you wouldn't give to certain groups of people, but it depends on whether they're received, to what extent they're immunocompromised.
Please tell us about the status and the promise of monoclonal antibody therapies and preventatives. I'm concerned about the difficulties in recruitment that Regeneron has encountered and the resulting postponement of their trial date. What can you tell us about all of this and how to resolve these issues?
It was surprising, actually. I expected that the Regeneron data, at least initially, would look better. If you have a monoclonal antibody and it's directed against that one part of the spike protein that you care about, which is the part that binds the virus to cells, the so-called receptor binding domain, there's no reason where if you give the monoclonal antibody early enough in the infection, when the virus is still replicating a lot, that you shouldn't be able to make a difference in treatment. And similarly, you should be able to use that as a preventive. The problem is you're giving somebody passive antibodies, and those fade out over time. Usually these longer acting monoclonal antibodies can last many months, which is a value. But that Regeneron trial was surprising. I mean, what you really want is you want people to be able to make an active immune response so that they make their own antibodies. So when they're confronted with the virus, they make their own antibodies on the spot, which is a lot easier than trying to keep giving the monoclonal antibodies. It's more of a stopgap measure. Maybe it could be used for people who can't get a vaccine. But we certainly need to get far better data than we're getting. You saw the plasma studies also. The FDA was initially looked like they were going to license or approve the use of plasma therapy, and now the FDA the people from NIH like Fauci and Francis Collins stepped in and said, no, the data just aren't good enough, and they weren't good enough. So I think vaccines remain our best hope.
So if Dr. Fauci says we can get the vaccine, that would be the stamp of approval?
Yes, I think, although what my friends say is that they're going to get the vaccine after my daughter gets the vaccine. So we'll see. But I think Dr. Fauci is this wonderful, brilliant man and great science communicator. He really is an amazing communicator. I remember hearing him when I was sort of a fellow, like in my late 20s, early 30s. I remember hearing him give a talk, and I thought, that's how you give a talk. You can give a talk that's interesting. You can give a basic science talk that's interesting. You tell a story. He's an amazing speaker, just a dynamic, amazing speaker as a scientist. And he can translate that to the public. It's not easy. You constantly have to translate the words you're used to saying into other words, and it's not easy.
What do you make of the data suggesting that the coronavirus antibody response wanes after about 6 months? Will immunity depend on T-cell responses? And is there a way to measure that? I bet it's more difficult, but perhaps not impossible. So why don't you first talk about T-cell response?
All right, so there's a couple questions there. Probably the most important question to answer with this virus right now is, does natural infection protect you against moderate to severe disease associated with reinfection? That has to happen. If that doesn't happen, you're going to have a hard time making a vaccine. If natural infection does not protect against moderate to severe disease associated with reinfection, you're in trouble. And that's true for a number of pathogens. Like, for example, you can get strep throat again and again and again. That's why we don't have a strep throat vaccine. You can get gonorrhea again and again and again. That's why we don't have a gonorrhea vaccine. I mean, once natural infection can protect, then you can look at the immune response that's been generated to say, okay, that's the immune response I'm trying to mimic. So the good news is I haven't really heard about people who've had, say, moderate to severe disease with SARS-CoV-2 that then, say, 6 months later or so, get another moderate to severe infection with that virus. So that's good. In terms of T helper cells, you want an antibody response, a B cell response, an antibody response that B cells make antibodies, an antibody response that's T helper cell dependent. So and I assume that's going to be true. It's true for most viruses, and I think that's going to be true for here. The issue of duration of immunity, when you look at how long you detect antibodies in the bloodstream, what you have to realize is that memory B cells and T cells are also being generated, and you're not measuring those. And when you have memory, then if you're exposed to the virus, it takes about 3 to 5 days for those memory cells to become activated and differentiate, in the case of B cells, to become antibody-producing cells. And that's often good enough. So even if people don't have circulating antibodies, if they have memory, high frequencies of memory B and T cells, they can be protected against moderate to severe disease. That's true of many infections. So we'll see. We'll see what any of this means over time when we do the vaccine trials.
Okay. So how long do you envision it will be between the doses? And what happens if a person doesn't get the second dose within the correct time frame?
Well, so right now, these are 2-dose vaccines, usually separated by a month. There is some immunity that's induced by one vaccine. I'm sure that would be, at least to some extent, effective, although presumably less effective than a 2-dose vaccine, because it's always, when you get that second dose, you're boosting your frequency of memory B cells, you're boosting your frequency of memory T cells, you're boosting your antibody titers. So there's an advantage to that second dose. So I think there probably would be some protection after dose 1. You want to make sure you get that second dose a month later. It's all going to be difficult to do given how many people are going to need this vaccine.
I remember when the Shingrix vaccine came out, they told me they couldn't give me the first dose because they didn't have the second dose yet. So there was a supply problem.
Right.
Now,
There was a problem. It was mostly with the adjuvant, actually. It wasn't there. The adjuvant, I think, was being made at Rocky Mountain Labs in Montana, and there was just a backup in making that adjuvant.
So here's a question from Sweden. In Sweden, the schools for the younger kids remained open the whole pandemic. Today, the high schools are now open. How do you feel about the Swedish approach when it comes to schools and COVID-19?
So Sweden generally did not do as well as its neighbors in terms of hospitalizations and deaths. The areas around it, Denmark, Finland, et cetera, did much better than Sweden did. So they were willing to, or their bet, if you will, was that if we just let this virus roam wild, we'll get enough population immunity, natural immunity, that will stop spread. I think that's a bad bet. I just don't think that's going to happen. I don't think it pretty much ever happens. I mean, if you look at measles, I'm a child of the 50s. I had measles, as I suspect David did. We all did. And what that did when we got that virus, got infected with that virus, that gave us protection for the rest of our lives. Not just protection, but what's called sterilizing immunity, meaning that not only were you prevented against to have moderate to severe disease if you were exposed to measles a second time, you're prevented from being infected or even asymptomatically infected or mildly symptomatic infected. That's called sterilizing immunity. You're good. The virus doesn't touch you, and it doesn't touch you for the rest of your life. That's how good natural infection is. Nonetheless, every year there was a susceptible population. Every year, 1 to 2 million people got measles. Every year, about 50,000 people would be hospitalized with measles, and every year, 500 would die. And that's with a virus that induces much longer lasting immunity and much more complete immunity than this virus is going to do. So I don't think natural immunity was ever the way to go as a way to try and stop spread. So I think personally, Sweden made a bad bet.
Okay. So we discussed earlier that the vaccine is only being tested in adults. Will there be pediatric testing? And because there are children with chronic conditions.
Well, and children, period, even without chronic conditions, I think are going to ultimately need to get vaccinated. I think people feel a lot better about going back to school under those circumstances. No, the initial trials that are being done, Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, Johnson & Johnson, my understanding, none of them include people less than 18 years of age. So I'm sure it's likely that these vaccines will start to roll out before children have been tested, and so that they'll then be tested after the vaccines start to roll out. and they're going to have to be tested. I mean, you can't just give the vaccine to children if you haven't tested them in children. But I think they're going to be later to get these vaccines.
What are some of the side effects associated with each type of vaccine?
Well, what's been a pretty constant side effect, and for different reasons, is fever, including high fever, and then the symptoms associated with fever, like chills, headaches, muscle aches. And there's different reasons for that. For the messenger RNA vaccine, the reason is that it's not the messenger RNA itself, because that breaks down very quickly in the body, really in probably 15 minutes, 30 minutes, it breaks down. So it goes away pretty quickly. It's the complex lipid delivery system. Lipid can often be fever inducing. So I think that's probably what's doing it. With regard to these so-called, the AstraZeneca product or the Johnson & Johnson product, which are these replication defective simian or human adenoviruses, the good news is they're replication defective, meaning the virus can't reproduce itself and cause disease. That's good. The bad news is you have to give a lot of virus if it's not reproducing itself, if it's not amplifying itself. Roughly 10 billion infectious particles, and that too is fever inducing. So those are the symptoms that you're seeing.
Okay, so I got a definition of super seniors. They're individuals aged 85 years and older who report never being diagnosed with cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, dementia, or major pulmonary disease. So basically they're going to die of nothing, I guess. So you said we can't test ourselves out of this pandemic, but what about surveillance testing and pool testing?
Yeah, I mean, so these are it's valuable, I think, to be able to say that somebody is shedding a virus, or you think is shedding virus. We don't test for infectious virus, we test for viral genome. That's what the PCR is. Usually shed virus for about 5, 6, 7 days, infectious virus. That's when you're contagious. But you can be PCR positive for months. And so it's weird, actually, because messenger RNA, which is what this virus genome breaks down very quickly. So if you're still making if you still have messenger RNA, that means the virus is continuing to make genes, but not making whole virus, which is weird. I mean, I don't know any virus that does that. But so testing is hard because it doesn't really tell you who's shedding infectious virus. But if we did cycle times, in other words, how many cycles you have to go through to say that there was viral genome there, if it's fewer than 32 cycles, I think you can say that that person probably is shedding infectious virus. But we never learn that, even though that is known. People who do tests do know the cycle time. It would be nice to know that. Because then you can say, okay, this person really is likely shedding infectious virus, but this person who has a cycle time of 40 probably isn't shedding infectious virus. And so then what do you know when you've identified that person is now you can say, look, you have to quarantine yourself for 14 days. But remember, most people are asymptomatically infected or mildly symptomatically infected. Those aren't people that typically get testing done. And do you want to try and test the entire population that's currently asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic when they don't know that? It's just hard. That's why I'm saying just wear masks. It's so much easier. Assume everybody's infected, and I think we'd be better off.
So I'm curious. What do you do? Do you go out? I mean, have you dined out at a restaurant?
Yeah, I have. I've sat outside with my family, knowing that we're more than 6 feet away from other families, so that when we eat, and we're maskless, that we at least have that comfort. But yeah, I have dined out rarely. I mean, I came here to Avalon, New Jersey in mid-March, and I've gone back to Philadelphia when I've been on service and had to round. But for the most part, I'm just sort of hanging out here. And when my daughter, for example, wants to bring her friends here, I have to be tested before they come. Anybody has to be tested before they come and stay here.
Strict rules, huh? Okay. What causes some infections to yield lifelong immunity versus others to yield not such permanent immunity? I'm thinking specifically of chickenpox and shingles.
Right, well, those are all sort of different issues. As a general rule, this is sort of an infectious disease answer. If you have vaccines that are relatively long incubation period, so if you have viral infections that are relatively long incubation periods, like measles, which has an incubation period of 10 to 14 days. If that's true, then all you need is immunological memory, because you have that long time between when you're first exposed to when you develop symptoms. So now you're exposed, those memory cells are activated and differentiate and then make antibodies, and now you're protected. That's why you get what is sterilizing immunity, because there's so much time. For the shorter incubation period, diseases like this one, which has an incubation period of around 5 or 6 days, or rotavirus or influenza virus, I mean, those are short incubation period diseases. There, you don't ever get sterilizing immunity. You get protection at best against moderate to severe disease, but not mild disease or asymptomatic disease, asymptomatic infection. So that's one big difference is that. In terms of chickenpox is different. I mean, chickenpox, when you get it as a child, lives latently in your nervous system for the rest of your life. And so as you get older, or you're on immunosuppressive therapy, or you've had a terrible sunburn, or you're on chemotherapy, that virus can reactivate and then travel down the nerve root and cause shingles. So you're really always infected. You're always shingles, or the chickenpox virus is always living in you, and then it reawakens and causes shingles. So that's just a different kind of virus. That's what herpes viruses do. And chickenpox is in the herpes virus family.
So there was a pandemic in 1968, and there was no lockdowns. Woodstock happened a year later. That was a large gathering, obviously. And you know, Bill Maher talks about this. I have friends who talk about this. Said, I don't even remember the pandemic in 1968. And I realized that people didn't get that sick. People didn't die. It was a flu pandemic. But so we've had pandemic experience, but I guess we haven't learned much from it.
I think the old joke is that if you remember the 1960s, you probably weren't there. But okay. What I would say is that that when we've had flu pandemics before, so there was a flu pandemic in '57, there was a milder flu pandemic in '68, there was a flu pandemic in 2009. The most recent one was associated with about 12,000 deaths because we had a vaccine in advance of that pandemic. You know, the fact of the matter is this past year, we had 50 million cases of flu, 780,000 hospitalizations, and 60,000 deaths from flu. We're willing to grandfather that in. I mean, we never see flu as a big deal because I think, one, people tend to put flu into the category of other sort of mild respiratory infections, which it's not. Flu really knocks you on your butt. And I think that we grandfather flu in. We just see it as people, when I've been asked questions on in other venues, people will say the common flu or the typical flu. And what they mean by that is it's not a big deal, but it is a big deal. I mean, it kills people every year. I mean, last year, 164 children died of influenza. How many children have died of this virus? Fewer than 50, meaning less than 18 years of age. So 3 times, and that's, you know, with a virus now, COVID-19, which has killed more than 170,000 people, only 50, fewer than 50 were killed of children were killed. Why we grandfather flu in, I don't know. Because maybe it's because it happens every year. I guess if this virus happens year after year after year and it's causing, let's say, 20,000 deaths, 30,000 deaths, we start grandfathering it in too.
So far worldwide, there have been 789,000 deaths, and in the United States, 173,000 deaths, which is a lot. So I didn't see this coming. I had other plans for this summer. Did you see a pandemic coming? Did you think it was inevitable?
No. I mean, not only did I not think, I mean, I was on CNN International with Christiane Amanpour getting this virus dead wrong. I mean, because if you're going to, you know, be wrong, go big. And you know, I just went on CNN International and said, I just cannot imagine that this virus will be as bad as flu. I mean, flu is going to kill tens of thousands of people this year. Do we really think this virus is going to do that? Yes, that's exactly what it did. I think the other thing that's amazing is, I mean, it's an enveloped respiratory virus that's spread by small droplets. What is it doing thriving in the summer? I mean, it's because it has an envelope, this sort of, you know, lipid membrane. It should be very susceptible to heat. Similarly, when you transmit something by small droplets and it's humid out, those droplets acquire water, they drop more quickly. That's why you don't see flu in the winter. Flu's gone. Yet this virus rages on in the summer. No one would have predicted that. I certainly didn't. I mean, you know, when Donald Trump said, you know, I think this is going to start to fade in April. I mean, that was actually not an unreasonable thing to think, just like flu fades in April. But he ended up not being right because he doesn't always get the science right, as it turns out.
That's true. So here's a question. I've read that antibody tests almost always just test for the nucleocapsid protein and not for the spike proteins. Is that true? Question mark. And if antibodies to spike proteins are considered to be the best target for vaccines, how are we measuring immunity by our current antibody test?
Right. So if you're just trying to see whether someone's been exposed to the virus, you usually look at conserved proteins like the nucleoprotein. When you're looking to see whether there's a neutralizing antibody response, that is a test of antibodies against the spike protein. It's what antibody tests have taught us is that we've vastly underestimated this infection in terms of how much it spread. When people say that there are 5.5 million cases in the United States, if you look at antibody testing, remembering most people with asymptomatic infection are not going to be identified as cases, it's 10 times that. We probably have 55 million cases in the United States. That's the more accurate number. In terms of trying to figure out whether or not a vaccine is going to work or not, the neutralizing antibody test is the better test. But even then, it's not clear that that's a clear immunological correlate for protection. You're only going to know that when we do these phase 3 trials and you see who gets sick and who doesn't. I mean, what you imagine what happened is that there'll be people in the vaccine group who get the vaccine and don't get sick, and people in the vaccine group who get the vaccine and do get sick. And you'll have serum on all those people. And you'd like to think that what you'll find is that those people who had a neutralizing antibody level above a certain amount were much more likely to be protected than those who had neutralizing antibodies below a certain amount. But remember, about half the vaccines on the market today don't have a clear immunological correlate of protection. I mean, the vaccine that I worked on at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, the rotavirus vaccine, never had an immunological correlate of protection. We had kids who got the vaccine who got sick, kids who got the vaccine who didn't get sick. We had serum on all those kids, and we could not find an immunological correlate. So it's not as easy as it sounds.
So short of a vaccine, are there any medications to make people feel better or ameliorate the? I mean, I know some have come along for people who are very ill in the hospitals, but for the average person, there's no Tamiflu you can take for this.
No, I mean, remdesivir is an antiviral that's given to people who are hospitalized. And it shortens the length of illness by about 4 days. It's no clear evidence that it protects you from dying, but it does seem to shorten illness. But then, no, there's not a magic medicine. I know that we're looking for the magic medicine, whether it's ingesting bleach, like Clorox chewables or something like that, or now the oleandrin, which is an oleander flower extract, is being promoted by the My Pillow guy, because I think if you're trying to trying to have our president sort of get the best advice, you don't want to get it from like molecular biologists or cellular biologists or virologists. You want to get it from people who make bedroom accessories. That's where I think you want to get your advice. So I'm sorry, these are jokes. See, the thing that those were jokes. Don't take oleandrin. That was a joke. Or Clorox chewables, which actually don't exist. I made that up.
Unfortunately, we muted all the participants, so they can't, but I'm sure they're laughing at all this. Can mRNA be shed and survive transmission to another person? And if yes, can the mRNA direct formation of whole viruses in the recipient?
No.
Okay, so easy answer. What are the major mysteries of this virus compared with other known viruses?
Good question. I would say here are the things that were most surprising. Number one, this virus has a predilection for nursing homes. The flu also kills older people, but if you look at sort of flu deaths every year, fewer than 10%, around 8% are in nursing homes. This virus is 42%. In some regions, it's more than 50%. That's what happened in Belgium. Belgium, which has a nursing home culture, was hammered by this virus because of that. That's number one. Number two, we talked about it earlier, it rages during the summer. Nobody would have predicted that. Two, it causes a disease in children that no known virus causes. It's sort of a combination of something called Kawasaki's disease, which is a multi-system, multi-organ inflammatory disease, and in combination with something called toxic shock syndrome, which again, no known virus causes, and toxic shock syndrome is as bad as it sounds. And then four, it causes a vasculitis, which is to say inflammation of the vessels. This virus affects the cells that line vessels, endothelial cells. Now it's not detected in the bloodstream. I mean, this doesn't cause so-called viremia, meaning virus in the bloodstream. It doesn't do that. So there's some other immunological effect that it's inducing that causes vasculitis. So you get this thing, which is inflammation of the vessel. So you get like COVID toes, which looks like frostbite, because of involvement of the vessels. You have people who are at risk of heart disease or brain disease because all the organs in your body have a blood supply. So therefore vasculitis affects all the organs in your body. No respiratory viruses do this. I mean, this bat coronavirus, which has just been out there for 8 or 9 months or so, is already had a number of clinical and pathological surprises that no one would have predicted. I mean, just to sort of hang crepe. I mean, if you really want to get nervous, and so you have this difficult to characterize evanescent virus, this elusive virus that you are now about to try and confront with a series of vaccine strategies for which there is no commercial experience. I think that we're going to learn a lot over the next 2 years. I suspect there are going to be some things we learned then that we wish we knew now. I do wish that these companies, I'm thinking of Moderna and AstraZeneca in particular, would stop beating their breast every time they have a press release, you know, where they've just tested the vaccine in 15 people or 10 people, and then they talk about how they can make tens of millions of doses. There is going to be a learning curve here. There always is. I mean, nature gives up its secrets slowly, grudgingly, and invariably with a human price. So be humble, keep your eyes open, and we'll see what happens over the next 2 years. I mean, I think we can get this in control, but this is a war, and there's often some casualties in war.
So about transmission of COVID-19 in children. Are children the drivers of the pandemic? Do they often initiate the spread of the infection in a household? Now, I know when I had young children, I was sick all the time. So I guess that's the question. Are children driving this pandemic?
Well, so on the one hand, it is true that children get this infection less frequently and less severely. That's true. Now, there's a reason for that. The virus binds to a receptor on cells called the ACE2 receptor. And young children don't express that receptor on cells very well. It's a maturational receptor. So you see it increase over time. By the time you're 18, that's when it's sort of at adult levels. But that's probably why they get infected less frequently and less severely. That said, when they are infected, especially when they have moderate to severe infection, they actually transmit the virus or have greater quantities of the virus than an adult. Plus, they're not great at like mask wearing and social distancing. You know, I really think if children's saliva was, say, purple, you know, basically you'd see the rooms where they're in pretty much all coated in purple. I mean, that's who they are, and so they're not good about social distancing, and so they can be spreaders, of course. That's why people are worried about going back to school for kids.
If you had a young kid, would you want them to go to school?
Not yet, no. Unless I went to the school and you know there was. You know, they clearly were separate. It's so hard. I mean, it's so hard to get, especially young kids, to wear masks, especially anybody less than 2. If you ever watch a less than 2-year-old wear a mask, it's like the opposite of wearing a mask. So I think it's hard. I think we just maybe have to hunker down and let this thing get under some control before we try and crawl back out again.
Do you worry about the mental health aspects of, I'm living alone, but my daughter said she would trade places with me in a minute because she has her husband trying to work from home. She's teaching online at home. She has a 2.5-year-old and a 5-month-old. And she said, I never get a break. So my life is easier than hers, I think. But do you worry about the the long-term effects of kids not playing with other children, not being in school, families being together?
I mean, even bigger than that. I mean, there's 2 aspects of this pandemic. One is the suffering and hospitalization and death caused by the virus. The second is in this process of trying to get control of it, we have massive unemployment that's resulted in massive, homelessness and food insecurity, and then all the problems that come with homelessness and food insecurity, like, mental health issues, depression, suicide, increased incidence of domestic violence, increased incidence of child abuse. I mean, that's all part of this. And it's a nightmare. So yeah, do I worry about the mental health? But also, I worry a little less about you, frankly, David, but I mean, there are, others. I mean, my mother's 92 years old. She's alone in her house. It's like a prison sentence. I have a friend who's in a nursing home in northern New Jersey, who is the pathologist at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, this brilliant woman who basically is in jail. I mean, they give you your meals under the door or through the door, and, she's really not allowed visitors. She can only just do things on the computer. It's just driving my mother crazy to have to live alone in her 90s.
So I just want to point out my next interview is called Carnival's Cure. It's be on Monday, and it's about leprosy, stigma, and the fight for justice. And lepers were treated very similar to some COVID patients. I mean, even worse. The reason this woman wrote the book is that her husband's grandfather had leprosy, and he just was taken in the middle of the night, taken to some leper colony. Nobody knew where he was taken. He didn't know where he was. And I think at least we don't have that going on. But many people faulted our governor in New York, Cuomo, for nursing home deaths by having people moved into nursing homes. I guess obviously he didn't mean to do that, but I mean, so if we all lock down, that's the question people may ask me. So let's say we all lock down. Like California was the first state to lock down, and now they have very high rates of the virus. So you have to open up smartly. But if the virus isn't going away, what do you do?
I think the three things that will get this virus under control are natural infection, immunization, and hygiene, and they'll all have to be used, and they'll all have to continue to be used. I think what's going to be hard for people to understand is, let's suppose you have a vaccine that's 75% effective. That's good. I mean, it'll prevent you from 3 out of 4 people will be prevented from moderate to severe disease, but it's unlikely to protect you against asymptomatic infection in which you could shed, or mildly symptomatic infection in which you can shed. And 25% of people are still not protected against moderate to severe disease in which you can shed. So should people who are vaccinated still wear masks? Absolutely. Get people to understand that. It's hard enough to get them to wear masks when they aren't vaccinated. I think it's going to take us a while to wrestle this virus because we just have this, for whatever reason, sort of instinctive dislike of wearing a mask. Like nobody should put a mask on our face. It's just hard to watch.
So someone says, I have vasculitis and take methotrexate to treat it. Will this protect me from the virus?
No, it will not. The question will be the nature, when the vaccine comes out, you're going to have to talk to your doctor to see whether or not you can get the vaccine because you're to some extent immune compromised. There may be certain types of vaccines that you can get.
What do you think is going on with the COVID long haulers? I'm not sure what that is. Is it direct damage from the virus or an immune-mediated response or both?
I think there's probably 2 things going on. I do think the virus can cause vasculitis, and therefore, I mean, can it cause chronic heart or chronic brain dysfunction? I think it is possible. What I do think is happening, this happened with sort of chronic Lyme disease and with sort of POTS disease and with fibromyalgia. I think there is a psychological component to someone who got COVID. Now they're, for whatever reason, they're a little depressed. And they sort of think that the virus is still replicating in them where it's not. Or there's not any really anatomical damage, it's more of a psychological damage, and that's much harder to get on top of and treat.
Okay, so we have just a few minutes left. So I'm gonna ask you just to say a few things, but when do you realistically think we will have a vaccine?
I think no later than first quarter of next year.
Okay, so that's in January, February?
Yeah, first quarter. I probably should stop making predictions. Remember, I'm the guy on CNN International who said I didn't think we'd have as many deaths from flu, so maybe I shouldn't make any predictions. Okay. But I think it's possible we could have it by early next year. I just can't imagine doing 30,000 person trials and having it ready before that, assuming these trials work. I'm assuming, which is to say, assuming the trials are showing that the vaccine is effective. It could be as early as next year, early next year.
We're going to be wearing masks for a long time.
I think we're going to be, we should be wearing masks probably for the next couple of years. I would predict.
And so the other thing that they said is that it's more important than ever to get a flu vaccine this year. Why is that?
Well, I mean, so flu last year, which causes an epidemic every year, usually starts around November, December, peaks January, February, starts to come down in March, April, May. Well, and cause, as I said earlier, hundreds of thousands of hospitalizations and tens of thousands of deaths. The SARS-CoV-2 came into this country and started killing people at the beginning of March. That was when flu was already starting to come down a little bit. So they were consecutive, not concomitant infections. If they're concomitant infections this year, imagine how easy it is to overwhelm the healthcare system. We were fighting last year not to have the healthcare system overwhelmed, and those were consecutive infections. Again, if they occur at the same time, I think it's going to be a real struggle. That's why it's important to get your flu vaccine to at least decrease your chance of getting severe flu, which is, say, the kind of flu that makes you go to the hospital. By the way, I'd just like to say that I proposed to my wife in a leper colony in Hawaii. Okay, since you brought up leprosy, I did. Like Lanai, there's a one of the Hawaiian islands is actually a leper colony, so it's still a leper colony, still an active leper colony. And I proposed to her there. She said no. She said yes later, but she has no sense of romance. That's my sense of it, right? I mean, what is more romantic than a leper colony? I mean, what am I missing here?
What's your prediction? So, the world has 22.5 million cases. The United States has 5.5 million cases. Where do you think it's going to go?
I think it will slowly peter out over the next few years, is what I think. I think we'll get on top of this with natural infection, hygienic measures, and a vaccine that gradually rolls out. I mean, I think we'll gradually start to roll out a vaccine next year in this country, and I think it will be rolled out in other countries next year. But it's going to take a while to vaccinate the world's population. I mean, this is 7 billion people. That's a lot of doses of vaccine, more than for any vaccine we've ever given before. And it's going to take a lot. I hope that we recognize our responsibility to the international community, that we're not making vaccines just for us, that we have sort of technological and economic advantages that mean that we have a responsibility to the world. And I mean, how much more information do we need to know that, what happens in the rest of the world affects us? And so we need to make sure that we're I think, good citizens here.
So there are countries that have done well. I mean, they're resuming their restaurant going, they're partying and everything else. Are they inevitably going to have more cases?
We'll see. I guess we'll see. I mean, certainly, I think Sweden was not a good example of how to do it. They certainly suffered more than their neighbors. There are countries like Germany who've gotten much more on top of this. Italy has gotten more on top of this than we have. Certainly, there are developed world countries that have done fine with this, and they're slowly trying to get back into the workplace and school by constantly, doing the things you need to do. Denmark, sort of brought people back to school, and there was a little blip, but it came back down again because they're pretty good about recognizing the kinds of standards that were initially set up here for the CDC that the administration didn't want to implement because they just didn't, and they just wanted us to go back to school and go back to work, and with an understanding, frankly, or a belief that that may mean thousands and thousands of more people would die, but that's okay because it could be sacrificed, at the altar of the economy, but people were unwilling to do them.
So would you take a subway or bus in New York City, given the low rates?
Let me put it this way. When I was on service in Philadelphia, I have to go to the hospital. It's about 2.5 miles from where I live, and I didn't take the bus to work. I took an Uber to and from work.
Okay. So, and museums are opening up in New York City next week. Would you go to a museum?
There, I feel a little better. I mean, so I'm on the board of trustees of the Franklin Institute, which is a science museum in Philadelphia. And I think I would go to that museum because, they really are good about social distancing, making sure everybody wears a mask. The people have Purell for their hands. So yeah, I feel a little better because you can social distance. You really can't social distance on a bus in Philadelphia when it's rush hour.
Well, subway ridership is down 93%, and buses are. So you may have a car to yourself. Anyway, let's end there. I want to thank Dr. Offit for his time. I know he's very busy. You were on CNN earlier today?
Yeah, on John King show earlier.
And so thank you very much for spending this time with us. And this is being recorded. We will post this on the usual channels, Facebook and Twitter, and on our own YouTube channel. And thanks again for taking time to speak to us.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Joseph. Take care.
Bye-bye.